Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all this Saturday morning as we celebrate another event in the Winter Tales programme. As you probably know, Scotland's first religious literary festival, marking 175 years of New College, this historic building here on the Mound in Edinburgh. Doubtless many theological discussions and religious debates took part, echoed through these halls, and indeed continue to this day, with rather more involvement from women now, I'm glad to say. Our guest today is esteemed academic and religious commentator, Professor Mona Siddiqui, and I know I share your delight and curiosity in hearing about her work, her writing, and her thoughts on 21st century religious thinking. A couple of things I have to mention before we continue. Again, masks where you can, and unless you're exempt, of course, are required to be worn throughout the event and while moving through the building. We are following government guidelines about track and trace, and your details have been gathered for that purpose. We're not planning a fire alarm drill, so if the fire alarm sounds, you should consider it to be real and make your way to the fire exits, which are signed around the hall. And again, just to ask you to maintain a reasonable distance from others at all times, and especially while leaving the building. It seems strange to be saying that, particularly at this time of year, doesn't it? But that's where we are. But the main thing is, I do hope you enjoy this morning's event, and we are enormously grateful that you've joined us. Allow me a brief introduction. Mona joined Edinburgh University School of Divinity 10 years ago this month as Chair of Islamic and Interreligious Studies, having spent the preceding years directing Glasgow University's Centre for the Study of Islam. Her research areas cover the field of Islamic jurisprudence and ethics and Christian-Muslim relations. She, of course, has numerous indeed, publications to her name, including her latest work, Human Struggle, which is available upstairs if you would like to avail yourself of that later. And of course, more recently, she's been studying the theme of gratitude in Christian and Islamic thought. In her podcast series, Living Gratefully, she examines with a variety of guests how gratitude shapes our relationship with others and how cultural relationships shape public discourse. And if you haven't already done so, then I would urge you to have a listen. A very warm welcome to you, Mona.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I've heard you say in the past that you don't care much for labels, whether religious or secular, but the first Muslim to hold a chair in Islamic and interreligious studies here, and given that we will be talking about your faith and how it's informed your work, that must have felt like a landmark moment.
I should say yes, but for me it was a career move. I thought of it more as a career move rather than I'll be the first ... And I think that's what shaped my work here, that this is the next stage of my career, and what can I do here that I haven't already done in Glasgow, in terms of building up both what I was invited to build up, which was the whole area of Islamic studies, but also what is the value added I can do here. So, yes, I mean, it's kind of you to say that, and people said that when I joined Glasgow University, because until my appointment there had never been a non-white, non-male, non-Christian member of staff in its, I think, 450 years of existence. But I again saw that as, oh, I'm so grateful I've got a job, and, you know, I can start earning and building my life here. But I think one isn't always aware of how the public sees different appointments. And I also have to thank, before I go into any further, everyone who's turned up here. I always say to people, I wouldn't come out and listen to me. So thank you all for coming out.
Absolutely not the case, but I suspect there were expectations of how you might fulfill that role, and perhaps particularly press attention that wouldn't have seemed important to you because your focus, as you said, was on the job in hand and the career move that you'd made.
I think partly because religion is so politicized at the moment that I mean, in some ways, the press have been very, very fair and very generous whenever they've covered anything I've said or done. But I think there is a sense that people are waiting to see, in this kind of situation where religion is politicized, or it's only in the public forum when something happens, usually something negative. So people, and especially when it's a position to do with Islam, or what kind of person is going to hold that position? What is he or she going to look like, especially if it's a woman? Are they going to cover their hair? Are they going to speak in a certain way? Are they going to look Muslim? So when I, going back to when I had my position at Glasgow University, there were so many people who thought, well, she doesn't even look Muslim. And I thought, I don't want to be dealing with any of that. I don't want to get into that kind of debate, which is so reductive. So whenever the press have asked me to comment on anything or do anything, I've done it as honestly as I can within that context, rather than thinking this is about the politicization of religion and I should be saying this, rather than what I really want to say.
And how difficult has that been, almost watching your every step? Do you get bolder? Do you get more confident?
To be honest, I don't really get. I think if you are sincere in what you're trying to do, if you are being asked, I mean, as someone said to me, the time to start worrying is when the press isn't interested in you. So as long as you're not polarizing opinion, and as long as you're not saying things just to get press attention, but actually responding in a kind of, as you possibly can, not in sound bites. But yes, I think simple things like if I suddenly started talking in a different way, or if I did cover my hair, or if I did say something political, then there would be more interest. But I don't want to do any of that.
It's clear your focus is on where you see religious thinking today, where we are, and much of that is explored, as well as personal matters. Your book in 2014 about mainly your own life, being a Muslim woman in Britain. The theme of gratitude is something that interests you greatly, and its place in how it can influence public discourse. And I suspect it was a founding principle in your own upbringing, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Your family came to Britain from Karachi when you were 5, and 6 of you altogether. You're one of 3 daughters and 3 brothers. But what are your memories of the family home in Huddersfield? Just to give us an idea of young Mona and how all of this has formed who you are today.
So we lived for a year in Cambridge, and then we lived in West Yorkshire. My father came as a young psychiatrist who wanted to do more exams in the UK. But we ended up staying because my parents realized very quickly that this was a great country to build up your children's education. And for them, education was your salvation. If you could get your kids the best education, that's what really mattered to them. We didn't know any of this. We were just, it took me about 13 years to realize we were never going back to Pakistan, because I always assumed we would return. And we had a house there as well. So I think, to put it very succinctly, we were intellectually free, but socially very conservative. That's the kind of house I grew up in, which was a strange combination, because most families that we grew up with that were Muslim or South Asian, they were socially very free and intellectually very closed. So that actually slightly set us apart, but that meant that, some aspects of my life were very conservative. But that was fine. That was fine. And I think we were quite close in the sense that we didn't grow up as part of a larger community. We didn't grow up in areas that had, large immigrant populations. My parents were very concerned that we only had their influence, or the influence of our school and education. They didn't want us to be part of this wider community. And again, we were too young to really know why they were wanting to do that. And I suppose my sense of freedom really came when I started university. And that was a true sense of being away from home and then thinking for yourself.
And that independence of thought and the desire to learn, coupled with an appreciation clearly of what your parents, their expectations, I guess this, what we feel is an obligation to please them, which is enormous for many. And her wish that you would all succeed, an academic, a lawyer and a doctor, and you didn't disappoint. Did that, I suppose, freedom that university and the exposure that university would have given you, did you ever feel like railing against some of their expectations and their rules, which were almost invisible?
I'm sure I did. But I don't know. I think maybe when I look back, was it faith? Was it a sense of fear? Was it a sense of duty? Was it just your love for your parents, that you didn't want them to be disappointed in you? Perhaps it was all of that I knew where boundaries were, that I could push certain boundaries, but not all the boundaries. And so I made sure that when I was raising my own children, that I would allow them to push boundaries. I don't know whether I did that sincerely or whether I thought I was trying to raise them in a different way from the way I'd been raised, but I just thought, if you're really going to give kids freedom, then you have to be sure of yourself that that's a risk you want to take, because freedom comes with risks. So and maybe it's because I have boys also, and I know we live in a very gender equality focused world, but I think there was definitely a difference between the way girls were raised and the way my brothers were raised. And because I have boys, that disparity was never there. They were all given the same sorts of freedom. Am I happy with everything they've done or said? Probably not. But I can't say, oh, that's enough freedom. You have to come back now. I have to reel you back in. I think you have to allow your children to breathe, to find, to discover, and make their mistakes.
And of course, the virtues that you saw at home would come into play. And I'm thinking of hospitality particularly, very much culturally indeed. Giving children freedom comes with risks, but we all know we come home, and I did it too, Mona. I would come home and I would be a very different person to my parents. I would be the daughter they wanted me to be.
Sure.
You would go to church on Sunday, but they probably knew that you were different. But there are those elements that come back, that keep coming back. How much of what you experienced growing up within faith and within your own culture remain with you today?
I said to my eldest son once, he said, I don't know whether well, actually, this came as a conversation as a classicist at the University of Cambridge who is Jewish. We were having this discussion years ago, and I said, it's a real struggle how you try and maintain a sense of faith in your children. He said, Mona, my son came home, he was 21 at the time, and I said, you've got to come home. And he said, Dad, but I don't think I believe in God anymore. He said, I don't effing well care if you don't believe in God. You're doing Shabbat. That's all that matters. In the sense that sometimes what we really want is just the kids to show that they are still part of that same environment. We don't really want to know what they're thinking, because that might be disappointing. And I think also, I suppose the biggest difference is I wouldn't ever have thought of saying to my parents, because I never felt it, that I don't believe in God. But I think my kids might. A crisis of faith is certainly something that can impact people's lives at different times. But I'm interested in the fact that it's just enough, because is that part of hope, that they will be what they will be? There is also, you've laid the foundation, mm-hmm. You've given them the skills with which to educate themselves to survive in a competitive world and at times very challenging world. Do you think subconsciously, all will be well? Is that part of it too? I think that's a good way that's my next project, Hope. I think that's probably true. I think there's a sense, I feel, that I'm just going to let them be, and as long as they feel supported and loved and all the rest of it, let them just be who they want to be. Let them get things out of their system. But ultimately, I think we all return to our childhood in some ways, the older we get. But I have said to them, I don't want you to stop believing. It doesn't matter if you don't practice. It doesn't matter if you don't observe. But I want you to have a sense of, if not God, then that there is something that should humble you. That, you aren't master of everything in your life, as young people often tend to think they are. And that sense of humility, really, that and gratitude. And I know it sounds a bit, well, does it really work? But I think it does, because I think even if you have these conversations, you're not actually saying, oh, I'm so disappointed you didn't do this, or you're not doing this anymore. But actually they learn what you're feeling through those kinds of conversations.
Is humility a virtue?
Yes, I do think humility is a virtue, actually. I think humility is a virtue, but not necessarily being a doormat. And I think there's a difference. I think humility is a virtue in the sense that it grounds you in a sense of whatever you've achieved, you are grateful for that. You're aware of everyone who's brought you to that stage in life. You haven't done it on your own. And also that there are always going to be people who've achieved far more than you. I think humility and gratitude are actually bound, because although gratitude is a problem as well as a virtue, as a person of faith, I think gratitude keeps you grounded. It keeps you focused. It keeps you feeling that actually for everything that's happening, life is still good, and this is what I can do to make it better, for not just myself, but for others around me. But we don't tend to have these conversations, because I think people feel that the real conversation in public life is really about politics and how that polarizes and, you know, the gritty stuff, and this is just woolly stuff. But actually, when you think about how many people are suffering from mental health issues, how many people are increasingly going on retreats, how many people want just quiet time away from, you know, work, there's something else that we're not really tuning into in society that maybe all of us need to hold on to. And that is a sense of self and quiet and solitude and just being able to think about things in a slightly different way other than just simply work-life balance, which is all-consuming.
Some people might think gratitude is an intensely personal thing, it's a private thing and it's within you. And you look at your world, you look at where you are, and you are grateful that you are here and not there. But how can we turn it into something where it doesn't just empower us, we can use it to empower others?
Well, I mean, in this current context, university level, gratitude to colleagues, gratitude to those who often get ignored when we think about things like promotion and salaries and, you know, who does all the hard work behind the scenes. And I think that there's a sense that gratitude is about just saying thank you. No, it isn't. It's actually about knowing your place in everything around you. That people have not only brought you here, but you can also help others. You can be the one to raise others. And I think that's what I would call this sense of ongoing charity, charity in the true sense of the word, that you're grateful for what you've achieved or got, but you're also trying to help build the lives of others, others who may not know how to start, but because you've done it or because you think you can help. I think gratitude is a doing word for me. You know, you do things with gratitude.
Equally how you're seen. And I remember someone who's head of the humanities department at a university described you as a role model. And you probably didn't know that. No. But in a sense, it's that awareness too, but the responsibility that comes with being in public life.
So I'm slightly wary of role models phrases because I think that it's so easy to make people into role models or even worse, national treasures. And then you've got that pressure that they have to be performing in a certain way. And I think you often then don't see the person in their fullness. You only see the bit that you think is the model. But I think that, you know, it doesn't have to be somebody in public life. All of us can help one another. All of us can encourage one another, whether it's colleagues or friends or family. I think that the sense that I look at gratitude as a virtue, not as a problem, is recognition. Who do we choose to let into our lives and recognize them for what they do? And also a sense of not feeling entitled to things. Yes, I always say to my children, you know, ambition is a good thing, but not competitiveness. You know, you're not entitled to certain things. yes, work hard, and if you're recognized for that, that's great. But don't go life feeling that you're entitled to things, that things should come to you, whether it's money or anything else, because it doesn't work like that. And even if you have grown in an environment where you felt entitled or privileged, at some point that runs out. At some point you have to kind of think for yourself, fend for yourself, and be somebody that's respected. And I think if I go back to the one thing that I remember my mum especially always saying, she was never bothered about whether we were popular or not, or whether people liked us. She said, you must retain respect. You say, once you lose respect, it was a very, I think, quite an old-fashioned way of thinking about life, but I think I understand why she used to say it so much. Once you lose respect, whether it's personal or professional, that's very hard to get back. So, and I think in that, what she was really trying to say was just be careful about who you are and what you say, and not necessarily in a contrived way, but just, the sense that not everything is given on a plate. So work for it, but be mindful of how you are.
And perhaps we're distinctly more aware of it following the last year and a half, where things have been taken from us. Mm-hmm. Some would say our freedoms, our opportunities in many ways, and for some more than others. How much has that, I suppose in a way it's allowed us to be more introspective, but has that been, to your mind, a positive kind of introspection, in that it may have allowed us to consider where we really are, who we really are, and what matters?
Yeah, I think it had a personal effect on me directly, which was that although I was lucky, I was still working, even though working from home. I didn't have financial worries in the way so many people did. It made me realize that I wanted to do other things as well. And I know lots of colleagues and friends and people I know just randomly through work who've just left their work, who've left their job. Not necessarily everyone has a job to go to, but they just said, well, we think there are other things in life. I'm not finding the kind of meaning that I wanted to in my work life. And that got me thinking as well that actually, not only was it coming to 10 years here, and I thought, well, I've got one kind of big job in me left still, but also, actually, I want to do other things, that life really is very short. And it's very easy to be in an environment, which I'm very grateful for, don't get me wrong, but where everything is just happening as routine. And rather than end up leaving somewhere resentful or feeling, I really should have left 5 years ago, leave on a note or do something else as well, where you still feel that you've got something else to give, whether that's in the same place or elsewhere or abroad. So I actually at the beginning thought, COVID, I'm fine, it's not really having such a big effect on my life. But I think earlier this year I realized that underneath it all, it really was having an effect, this sense of working from home, and was that really what I wanted? But also, did I want to do something else? So yeah, it's had a direct impact on me. The one thing I would say about gratitude was the NHS clapping. I think we ended up with almost a tyranny of gratitude there, that if you weren't seen to be clapping, you were somehow a bad citizen. And I made the mistake of going out for a walk at, was it 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock?
8 o'clock,
and this woman said to me, I hope you're clapping while you're walking. And I thought, I've never set eyes on you before. Who are you to tell me this? I didn't say that, of course. I just carried on walking. But I think there was a sense that it's so easy to become judgmental in these issues. And I think that was a concern I had, that a lot of people, our kind of view of life was being reduced because COVID was the only talking point and the NHS was seen as our only salvation, that there wasn't, you couldn't think beyond those two things. So yeah, I did think that, maybe we're not really thinking about gratitude in the right way.
Yes, that's interesting, being judgmental and what feeds that. We could talk about so many of your publications and your papers, and so many. I wanted to talk briefly about My Way, a Muslim woman's journey, because you touch on many real issues facing Muslim women growing up in Britain today: love, sex, parenting, and death. What prompted this?
Well, in all honesty, it wasn't my idea. I didn't want to write it. It was a publisher who wanted me to write something that was kind of semi-autobiographical. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try and be as honest as I can. I'm not completely honest in that book. I'll be honest here and say that. But try to have some sense of objectivity, but within the context of issues that mattered to me or things that had happened to me. But yes, I enjoyed writing it. It was actually quite cathartic to go back and think about so many of the things, and so many of the things that you grow up with that you realize, sometimes to your shock, this is still really important to me. I thought I left it behind 20 years ago, but no, actually, this is still really important.
So it reveals more about yourself than you perhaps imagined.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely.
At the start. What do you consider, though, to be the main issue affecting Muslim women in Britain today? Because we talk about this focus, this reductive, I suppose, focus on the headscarf and face covering. And if so, if that's the case, what does that quite literally mask, this focus on a single issue?
So I think that one of the issues is that people always want to know what people's identity is, as if somehow we all have just one identity. And for a very long time, the identity was, well, you're either covered or you're not. But I think the larger issue for not just Muslim women, but maybe women of religious persuasion, is this fear of what people will say. I can't live my life because my family will say this, my brothers will say this, or my husband will let me do this. And although, of course, we have hundreds of examples of successful Muslim women or women who've broken barriers, etc., I think there's still a sense of a structure which, even if it's not as oppressive now, still judges women for what they are doing, whether they are breaking family ties, whether they are making it their own way, whether they are not observing certain codes. And I had to give a paper once at a Muslim women's conference. I've done very few of these, but that was the title, that this is our biggest fear, what other people will say. That keeps you back. You can't be, it sounds like a little bit of a cliche, but I think you can't really explore who you are if you are constantly thinking, what are other people going to say? And for some women, they can't be who they are because they are within context where it's very difficult to get out. And this is why there's the flip side of freedom, which is it's very easy to say to people, live life freely, etc. But freedom comes at a huge cost. And not everyone can find refuge once they've freed themselves. So for a lot of people, it's very easy to stay within boundaries and ties because at least there's safety there.
In a sense, going back to the idea of being judgmental, but how can we break free from those shackles? Because perhaps we all, if we're honest, carry a degree of being judgmental about people.
We do, absolutely.
And I think that is something that's very hard to admit to, but essentially it's almost like it happens and then you pull yourself back. We can't blame society for that, can we? Is that a generational thing, do you think,
I think
moving forward?
No, but you're absolutely right. When we feel, and I do it as well, when you feel that you're judging somebody simply by virtue of what they've said or what they're doing or whatever, just don't. Actually physically hold yourself back and don't go down that road of, because it's so easy to judge others. It's so easy. And just don't say anything negative. Wait till you explore who that person is a little bit before you judge them. And of course, with women, it's very easy to judge on appearance as well. So we make judgments all the time about how people look and how they're carrying themselves in public life. But, in a way, this is what the current argument about social media is, that it's actually very easy to be judgmental on social media because that's what everybody is doing. Everyone is judging everyone else on what they say, how they're coming across. So, of course, platforms can be a vehicle for huge good as well and for huge outpouring of sympathy, etc. But a lot of the time, that's really what they're doing. They're just judging.
Do you think it's a scourge of the modern world, despite, as you say, it can galvanise people into taking action for good, one would hope, but that there is always a danger with the praise, there will always be the negative, and how do we counter that?
Well, I think it's human nature, isn't it? You can get lots of plaudits for something, but as soon as you hear something negative about yourself, that's the one thing that sticks with you. And I suppose part of being able to just carry on is to park that and think, no, I can't let that define me. If you're sincere in what you're doing, you will just carry on, irrespective of the negativity that comes across. But yes, so much of this stuff that we talk about in public life is actually just down to human nature. But you know yourself, you can physically stop yourself from doing something or saying something that reduces somebody else. You can say something or just stay quiet.
And it's usually safer to stay quiet. But that doesn't happen, as we know. Interfaith understanding is something that you've written about extensively. Why is this important, and particularly when it comes to Christian-Muslim relationships?
Partly because so much of my thinking theologically has been in collaboration with Christian colleagues, friends who are Christian, and I realized that over the years, so many of the questions I was asked came from the prism of Christian theology, which is everything that matters to Christians should necessarily matter to people of other faiths. And I don't think there was any arrogance in that. I just think that that's the way most people try to have the conversations. So immediately the conversations would be about, well, what is Muslim salvation? Because salvation is so important in Christianity. And I was like, well, we don't really talk about salvation so much. It's about X, Y, and Z. And then I realized, no, my own thinking was becoming more enlarged, was growing through my conversations with people, especially with Christian colleagues. And so I thought, if I'm going to do this properly, I need to do this in a very focused way, rather than this generic interfaith with people of all faiths, which kind of leaves you with nothing, really. That's a different kind of approach. So yeah, that's really how I... And over the last, well, not in the last 5 or 6 years, but for 10, 11 years, I was part of a series of annual conferences that Rowan Williams, former Archbishop, chaired, called Building Bridges, which actually brought Christian and Muslim scholars. So you couldn't just be a scholar, you had to have a professing faith, together to talk about themes like prophecy, salvation, various things. And those I found fascinating, because then I realized that people just need to have a space where they can discuss in a scholarly way really important issues. And when we go back to our individual respective organizations, we carry that thinking, and that then does have a trickle-down effect.
Well, that's what I wanted to talk about, was the trickle-down effect, to make that meaningful for people for whom that might feel too scholarly, too academic, and the importance of taking that as a starting point and using it to inform public discourse.
Yeah, so my interest in the public aspect of my work has always been about how do you make complicated scholarly writings, books, journals accessible to a wider public, because I do think there is a hunger in public life for something that is in between press, newspaper articles, and, you know, these academic scholarly writings, something that raises a tone of religion, ethics, etc., in public life, but which is accessible so that people, because I think most people come to these things with good intentions, they want to learn. But, you know, conversely, I've had colleagues who've said, but, you know, it's because Islam is in the news all the time. I said, no, it's nothing to do with that. I was interested in this well before 9/11 or any of these big events that have shaped political discourse. And they'll say things like, you know, how are we going to make the Gospels interesting in public life? And I said, well, actually, I think a lot of people would find that very interesting. But it depends on how you shape the conversation and how you come into the public conversation with the learning that you have. So yeah, I think that public conversations, especially in the UK, where I think we do religion really badly, apart from you on Sunday, Cathy, apart from you on Sunday, could benefit from a little bit more nuance.
How challenging is it then to find that form, I suppose, that allows you to be respectful to the text, but equally make it accessible in a way that's salient to the reader or to society at large? Because I think there is sometimes a fear with people. There is this respect that becomes a wall, and I can't possibly cross that wall because I don't understand it enough. A fear, a lack of confidence
Yeah, and I think it's also very easy to stay committed to the traditional understanding of certain texts. And yes, you can start with that. You can say, well, this is how this has been traditionally understood, but I would like to add, because all interpretation interpretation is a living thing. And I say to people, even staunch Muslims, the Quran is a book that only comes to life when we interpret it, when we pick it up, when we start reading it. Whatever you think God's word means, it means nothing unless we do something with it. So I think things are changing now, especially, in the Islamic world, things have been far more conservative for a long time. But I think things have changed quite a lot in the last 10, 15 years.
Now, you mentioned Rowan Williams a couple of minutes ago, who was instrumental in human struggle coming to fruition, as it were. Tell me a little about that.
Well, this was, the Human Struggle book is really the reflection of the Gifford Lectures, which I was very honoured to give at the University of Aberdeen in 2016. The comparative element of it, looking at both Christian and Muslim writers, really came as a result of these Building Bridges seminars with Rowan Williams. Rowan Williams has been very generous in writing plaudits for the book, or the odd review or the foreword, but I don't think I would have done so much comparative work had I not been part of those conversations. And then subsequently meeting people, especially Christians, who are very keen to not necessarily be interfaithy, whatever that means, but actually to be interested in talking about their religion or faith or the problems or the struggles with somebody of a different faith, but who might be facing the same kind of struggle.
Would you like to read a short passage?
Just 2 or 3 lines,
and
thank you.
A little bit of context.
So this is just in the introduction. Words such as struggle can be interpreted in multiple ways. But in this book, struggle is often aligned to theological and anthropological dimensions of human suffering. Despite the differences in meaning, both point to the essence and the paradox of the human condition. We want to avoid struggle, and yet it's during times of struggle that we become, we grow, and we find deeper purpose and meaning in life. Writers and thinkers from all cultures and civilizations understand that we learn to live as we struggle, and that the concept is indispensable to our potential and central to giving greater weight to our lives.
Who was that book for? Essentially, would you say that's an academic book, or were you as much exploring your own thoughts?
Probably my own, yes. So I didn't want to make it a personal book, if I can put it that way, but I did want to think about what were the 1 or 2 struggles I had in my own personal life that started to make me, that made me think, actually, we don't talk enough about struggle. We talk about suffering, but struggle also has a positive element to it. We often come through struggle to something better, to a better place. And that when I was struggling in my own life with 1 or 2 things, how did I think about it? Did my faith give me assurance, or did my faith not play any part in it? And I just had to kind of soldier through. So the book is looking at people whose faith, both Christian and Islamic, gave them the confidence, or provided the support when they were going through intense periods of struggle. And perhaps the most difficult chapter in that book is looking at the lives of the Muslim writer Sayyid Qutb, who was a revolutionary in Egypt in the 1960s, and the Christian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I compare, but both were imprisoned for their writings, for their activism, but they wrote in prison. In fairness, I've had Christian colleagues who struggle with that chapter, who see the Muslim as the revolutionary, the radical, whereas Bonhoeffer is a saint. And they've said, how have you compared these two? But it's my work. I can compare who I want. So I just think that you need to read through, and you need to be able to demystify some of these figures that have become legends in their respective traditions.
We don't normally get personal, certainly not on Sunday morning, Mona, and we have very little time on Sunday morning. And on the Moral Maze, you're really rarely allowed to be personal. in the sense of your own personal life, but I'm interested in you talking about the struggle, sometimes the challenges in our lives, and what it forces us to address, and what we learn from those moments. What are you happy to share with us this morning?
I suppose, how many risks are you willing to take in search of your own ambition, in search of your own happiness? Where are your loyalties lying at that particular time that you're going through this struggle? Is it to work, to family, to partner, to children? And I think also perhaps the biggest question is, what is it that you're actually hoping to get out of this struggle that you're going through? You know, and I think to some extent, I found it easier that rather than thinking about the whole world at your feet and the expanse of the whole world, actually just start reducing that and thinking, there are certain things I simply cannot sacrifice. I am not going to do X, Y, and Z. I am not going to leave this, that, or the other. And then that starts to reduce the options that you have. And then that becomes more manageable. And then I suppose the biggest question is about happiness. Like, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What kind of happiness am I looking for? And I think that can be a really big question that we ask ourselves. And what will I do in pursuit of this happiness? What will I leave in pursuit of this happiness? So, you know, you can feel all these things with no answers, no clarity. And then the next day you're thinking, actually, I've just got various things to do. You know, I've got kids to look after, I've got to go to work, I've got to do this. And immediately that then grounds you in the reality of your life rather than this imaginary world that you're creating for yourself. And I think that sense of grounded in the joys of everyday life, as well as the struggles of everyday life, is how I then kind of came out of it, which is that actually life has so many joys. You're so fortunate to have X, Y, and Z, that rather than think about other things that are going to cost you so much personally and professionally, stay grounded where you are and make the best and the gratitude of that life.
And with you, the importance of faith and how that leads you through all of these struggles.
And I think that's because I think, as long as you... So faith reminds me of duty. Faith reminds me of happiness and work and commitment and loyalty, and all these things are all intertwined. You can't separate them. And I think also faith reminds me that actually there's another life where I'll be accountable. So whether people believe in that or not, I do. And I think that sort of makes me feel what you do in this life really matters.
It's almost handing it to a higher power. And people talk about
absolutely.
how that empowers them. And that's interesting. Maybe that's for another day. Because I wanted to also talk about when we go back to virtues. What, to your mind, are the important virtues when it comes to a cohesive, compassionate, and perhaps most importantly, tolerant society?
I think patience. I also think that I think humility does matter, because I think humility does make us more tolerant. And a sense of wonder, actually, that I don't know as much as I think I do, in the sense of not necessarily having random opinions on things, but in the sense of there's still so much to learn and discover. And I do think gratitude is important, because I think I just did these recordings with 4 artists in England on different aspects of gratitude in their lives. And I asked them at the end, one of them has a disability, and she said, and I asked them at the end, what was your regret when you look back at your life? And she said, just not having the courage to be grateful that despite my disability, I could be an artist. You know, I could do things. I wasted so much time thinking, what if, you know, why is this disability happened to me? And actually, all that time was just wasted thinking what ifs. And if only I had learnt to be grateful for what I had and carried on with my art. And one other artist who was heavily dependent on drink and drugs, who turned his life around and said it was actually writing notes of gratitude every day in the morning, thinking, this is what I'm grateful for today. That physical action, he said, helped me so much.
I think too, we forget identity and validation, in the sense that unless people, for example, someone saying they didn't feel they could, they wish they had been grateful and they hadn't seen the stumbling blocks but the way forward, is there not a duty to us as a society to value people and to allow them to have a voice and to be listened to? Because without that, we fall back.
Well, I think if you don't value people, then you make people feel very unwanted. And I don't mean that everyone has to go around praising everyone, but I think even in work environments, if people don't feel valued, that's when they start feeling restless. That's when they start feeling unwanted. That's when they start feeling taken for granted. And I think that there are all sorts of ways of valuing people. The main way is to how you actually talk to people, rather than creating hierarchies of value. Just speak to everybody as you would want everyone to talk to you. But I mean, even in this institution, you know, we've had 3 days of strikes here and there. A lot of it is about not feeling valued. Irrespective of what's happening with pensions and all the rest of it, when it comes down to it, the reason why people leave or people break ties or people decide to move on is because they don't feel valued enough in this institution. So, you know, most leadership courses now talk about not just leading with strength, but how you create a work environment where you ensure that people feel valued. And I think that's a real skill, but I think it's imperative to any organization.
And I'm not going to go into politics, but if we just say politics with a capital, with a small p perhaps, and the tired rhetoric, if I can call it that, lack of trust in our leaders, whoever they may be, how do we regain trust and instill confidence into this generation, perhaps generation of students, whilst encouraging them to retain their identity?
Well, lack of trust, I mean, trust is important. I think we are, as human beings, hardwired to trust. I would rather go through life trusting rather than distrusting or even mistrusting. But I do think that if you see, leadership comes with its own burden, its own responsibility. So I think that if you are in a position of leadership and you are seen to be saying one thing, doing another, that immediately creates distrust in people around you. And if you're in a leadership position where you have access to a lot of privilege and you're taking advantage of that privilege, again, there's a mistrust there. So any leadership position, I would say, whether it's in politics or whether it's in universities or wherever, is really about, again, I go back to humility, a sense of, I have a really responsible role here, and I need to show that I'm not only going to help those who I'm leading become the best they can, but also practice that in my own self. And I think that this is probably why trust in society is breaking down a little bit, because people feel that once people have made it to a certain level, they do whatever they want, irrespective of the consequences to those around.
But there is fear too.
In the sense of?
Fear of saying the wrong thing, and how much does that hold us back? Perhaps a greater force than before.
Yeah, I mean, people say, oh, you've got to choose your battles. But I think if you go through life never saying anything to leaders because you're afraid of the consequences, then you're being hypocritical yourself. You talk about acting in good faith, you talk about leadership, you talk about humility, you talk about bringing colleagues with you or whatever. But at some point you have to say, this is not on. What you did here is simply not acceptable. How you say it and in the context in which you say it is entirely up to you. But I do think people live with, I don't want to call it whistleblowing, but I think people live with a certain sense of, in order to survive in any work environment, you have to just bite your tongue. I don't think that's a healthy way to work. Not everyone has the privilege of being able to speak, but I think if you don't create an environment where people feel they can actually say things that are worrying them, especially over the last 18 months or so, then that's not a healthy environment. You're not going to hold on to those colleagues.
And in a sense, we've created an environment today. You have, by introducing the first religious literary festival. It's actually quite hard to believe, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what that can mean. I mean, the programme itself is extensive. How important is something like this in terms of what we can learn from religions other than our own, but actually what it's all about?
So I don't think I'm really proud and, credit to my colleagues and my head of school who's sitting there, Professor Helen Bond, Professor Jolyon Mitchell and Dr. Alison, forgotten Alison's second name, Alison Jack, who've kind of put all this together. But I think also thanks to all the participants who are coming to speak. But, people, there's a kind of humorous side that people in the university don't know what we do here. They don't even know what, New College is. But there's that side. But then there's also this side of how important arts and humanities are to the way we think of life. And if anything, in the last 18 months or 2 years, we've realized that creativity is lacking in our public discourse, and that the function of arts and humanities, in a broad sense, especially literature, is to open up new worlds, is open up new ways of thinking about things. That's what writers do. They open up new ways. And I think the writing, whether it's theological or whether it's fiction, that people really enjoy is that where the writer brings something of themselves to their writing. It doesn't matter whether you're an academic and you think, oh, no, my writing is so scholarly and so objective. You're still bringing something of your interest to that particular discipline. I think we should make this an annual thing. Yeah. And I think that if there's anyone here who wants to participate, or who wants to sponsor, who wants to fund, who wants to be part of it, because, despite COVID, despite the fact that we've got work going on, that we couldn't have the exterior the way we wanted to, I think it's really important to bring people in to look at the intersection between faith and literature. Because people think that the two worlds are separate, they're not. So yeah, I'm really pleased that we've been able to pull this off in some ways.
Yes, it was quite incredible to look at how it was broken down. And when I saw Val McDermott was on the list, I thought, oh gosh, how does that work? But, it's kind of, it opens your mind, but it also, I suppose, reminds us of how it literally appears in every walk of life. And it's pushing those boundaries and offering people an alternative view too. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I mean, without access to writing, it sounds very basic. We just wouldn't know so much. But when you have writers and academics who can actually bring something alive, then I think what you're doing is inviting the audience into your personal world. It's not just about you saying a few things about history and the evolution of a faith or whatever. It's actually inviting people to almost a different world. So they're not just seeing you as, Christianity believes, Islam believes, Judaism believes, which is such a reductive way of thinking about faith, but actually looking at that the people who are practicing their faith, or even academics and scholars of faith, are complex in the way they think about their work, but also the religion that they follow.
And whose writing inspires you, Mona?
Oh, gosh. Well, at the moment, I'm reading, now I've forgotten who I'm reading, the Rumpole books. Partly because it's an area of life, the whole legal world, that I'm not aware of so much, but which I find fascinating. So, I think there was a discussion last week on Radio 4, I think, that our modern books, are their sentences becoming too short? And what we really want is the classics where the sentences are really long. That went on for about 10 minutes, that discussion. I think that I think I'm somewhere in the middle. Yes, not very long sentences. Yes, absolutely. So, yeah.
And in terms of where you get your emotional strength, out with this hallowed institution, what gives you the emotional strength to come back, and what fires your imagination?
It's a really difficult one. I think it's just a sense of feeling life is good. That's what gives me emotional strength. I'm not looking for inspiration in high places or anything, just a sense of, yeah, life is good, and there's almost a moral duty to keep going and to be saying certain things. And yeah, as long as you have your health and people still want to hear you say things, yeah, give something back.
And you're fortunate, we didn't even talk about the beautiful cover of Human Struggle. And I suppose in a sense it's that awareness that there are still, for example, the young artist who drew that, she has a personal story. And it's all these personal stories that we all want to hear. The importance.
Absolutely, and I do want to pay credit to Sonia, who is a master's, well, she might be a PhD student now, but when we had the project on Human Struggle, I commissioned an art prize with the Glasgow School of Arts, who were actually very, very welcoming. £1,000 for the best art, material arts that could evoke gratitude, and we had quite a good turnout actually. But she won, a young Iraqi student who lives in Glasgow. Her painting was just amazing. So she was covered in the local press, in the Glasgow School of Art bulletin, but also by New College itself in our bulletin. And so I went back to Sonia to design the cover of the book, which she did, which has both Christian and Muslim archers intertwined. But yes, when I found out her life, a young Iraqi girl wanting to be this international artist. She's already had lots of shows very up and down the country. Where you start in life and where you might end up, that is an amazing journey.
And it's wonderful. And she too brought gratitude
absolutely
into her discussion and clearly into her project. Finally, and if anybody has any questions to ask, we do have a few minutes. Please feel free just to raise your hand, because Mona's quite happy to take your questions. Yes, please do. I don't think we have a microphone, but we should. Yes, I think that might work. We've got a microphone coming to you, just in case. That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that's a really good question. And actually, I've worked on... So it's, how would I like to extrapolate on the theme of friendship and gratitude? I think that's in a nutshell. I suppose I have written on friendship, and I've thought a lot about friendship, actually, partly because I think I've let go of too many friends. I've not kept up my own friendships. And when I look at my children, I see that this culture, when you're in your late teens or early 20s, this is a culture of friendship. The children, their friends are their family in some ways. And I know people say this all the time, but I think there has been a cultural shift in the way friendship has become to define so much of what young people are about. And that's why there's so many of them found it hard in the last 18 months. I don't think I've been grateful enough, actually, for some of the friendships in my life. Because I think even when you're in your 20s, you think you'll just go on forever making friends. And that's not true. You just don't go on endlessly making friends. Not the kind of friends you want to rely on. And I think if I have a regret, that is one that I wish I'd held on to some of the friendships I'd made earlier in my life. Because I think to have a really close... I always used to say I wanted 3 things, and I don't think I've got any of them. I wanted to be really close to a grandparent, but my grandparents all died when I was very young. I wanted to have a childhood friend, which I never did. And I wanted to be a spy, which I never became. So I haven't held, the spy thing is probably my biggest regret. But in seriousness, I think friendship, I think we underestimate the power of friendship. And I think people who have a group of friends that they are close to, or even one really close friend, they're really lucky.
Do we have any more questions? Any more questions? We don't. Finally, Mona, and with enormous gratitude for today's session, which has been a sheer delight for me, and I know I speak for everyone here today. What next? What are your plans that you can share with us?
So from next year, I will still be at Edinburgh University, but my hours will be reduced, and I will be working abroad quite a lot. So I'll still be hopefully here. But I do want to work with new students, new colleagues in the States and in Europe. So that's going to be my next move, all being well.
Well, we'll look forward to that. I would like to encourage everyone here to tune into your podcasts, Living Gratefully, on whatever your podcast provider is. Mona, thank you so very much.
Cathy.
Thank you for joining us. And please enjoy the many other events here today at the Book Festival. Thank you,
Cathy.